Everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today I've got Mark and Richard with me, and Matthew is going to be joining in just a few minutes. How's it going, guys?
Good for us. Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Lovely. We've got a slightly unusual episode today. We're talking about the attitudes of Palestinians towards October 7th, and so we're going to play a video that was just released by the Free Press yesterday. They've actually released a little slew of videos from when they visited the West Bank earlier this year, and interviews that they conducted and visits to kibbutzes. And they're all really good. We're focusing just on the one that they did conducting interviews with Palestinians because I think it's very revealing and very interesting. And we're going to play that for you guys as well, and then we're going to comment on it. And we'll probably also reflect on the international situation and why, in a sense, I think a lot of people in the international community have a hard time believing that this is the attitude of the Palestinians on the ground. But just before we get started, there were a few super chats from the Daily Objective, which we'll just read out now. So we had $2 from Ashley Shrugged, thank you so much, and then £2 from Apollo Zeus, who said altruism and pacifism and the situation ? I don't know what that was in reference to because I didn't see the Daily Objective, but I'm sure that's a relevant question. Maybe Daniel, if you have an answer, we can answer it at the end. Okay. So did you guys have any first impressions before we watch the video to set it up for people what they might expect?
Well, to be honest, it's fairly self-explanatory, isn't it? I think there's lots to draw out of it. I think in terms of the familiarity with what people say, in terms of the mixture of propaganda and ideology, and how much of this is going to come as a surprise or not, depending on who you are. I think that's the gist of it.
And something that Daniel said earlier on in the TDO, that the popularity of the leaders of Hamas since October 7th in the West Bank has actually rocketed. Effectively, the population in the West Bank sees the action, the murderous actions that Hamas committed on 7th October as something positive, something that perhaps their leadership should follow up, which is pretty damning.
Yeah. Okay, so let's launch into the video. It's about 7 minutes long, so it's not too long.
Is it also a tragedy what happened to innocent Israelis that day?
It is a tragedy, but it is comparing with what happened to Palestinian people. It is maybe 1%. Why the world close its eyes? What happened to Palestinian people about before 70 years? Just now they see us. But now they see us. But.
Poll after poll has found widespread support among ordinary Palestinians for Hamas and for its actions on October 7th last year. Months after the attack, Israel's military offensive in Gaza made it impossible for us to go to the Strip, where the death toll and the deprivation are staggering. But we wanted to know what Palestinians think about the attack, about the war, and about the future. So we visited the West Bank, first to the key political and cultural center of Ramallah, and then to the Kalandia crossing, through which thousands of Palestinians cross each day into Jerusalem. One note, some of what they say in these interviews is untrue. Israel, for example, does not occupy Gaza.
This morning's cabinet approval legally authorizes the IDF to begin evacuating all the settlements in Gaza.
It pulled out unilaterally from the territory in 2005. After that, Hamas, a designated terrorist group, took over, and it has governed there ever since. Hamas runs Gaza like the mob, controlling every aspect of life, from schools to hospitals and charities. And while its leaders live in Qatar as billionaires, aid money, stolen from the Palestinian people, is used by Hamas to buy black market weapons and to build tunnels where terrorists can shelter from the war, while ordinary Palestinians are left to fend for themselves. But the goal here wasn't to debate, it was to listen to the unfiltered views of ordinary people.
What do you think of what happened on October 7th?
أنا ضد إيذاء أي مدني بس بالنهاية لما أنت تعتدي على شخص لمدة 70-80 سنة ما تتوقعش منه يكون إنه مسالم يعني أنا ما ببرر أي هجوم بس الغزيين محاصرين من 20 سنة أكل بدخلش شرب بدخلش no food, no water, no anything, no supplies, and you keep shooting them every year just for fun or just to make your people enjoy. You shoot people and you kill them, and you what did you expect? What did you expect?
غزة هي سجن صغير لإسرائيل. في الأكل بتمنع الدخول عليه، الدواء بتمنع الدخول على غزة، الطير بيمتنع الدخول على غزة. فكانت هي نتيجة لحصار إسرائيل لشعبنا في غزة. حاولوا أكثر مرة أنهم يفكوا الحصار الناس، إلا أن إسرائيل ظلت ضاربة في عرض الحائط. فآخر إشي وصل لهذا الاحتلال ما أخذ بالقوة لا يسترد إلا بالقوة، لأنه هو ما بفهم إلا لغة القوة ولغة القتال.
The first look was come to my, there is someone protect me. There is someone, hear my voice, there is someone do actions. I don't prefer killing people, but what was the reason? Because I help to save souls. But should be an action. I know there should be an action because the Israeli soldier or Israeli leaders should know we are here and we will defend our rights.
They took an Israeli.
Let's just pause it there, Daniel. So as the video goes on, we'll get into, in a sense, more revealing comments, but those are kind of the introductory slew. And I think there's already so much to say about that one, or about these few that we've seen already. But Marco and Richard, before I say what I have to say, what did you guys think of those? What's your reaction?
It's quite depressing. It kind of confirms that these guys are actually totally brainwashed. They don't really even care what's happening on the other side of the other chunk of so-called Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, because they clearly keep coming out with platitudes. Even the guy talking about not even the birds can go to Gaza. Come on, and the younger guy talking about the crossings, the Palestinian crossing into Jerusalem. Well, they cross there because they want jobs. Clearly, they turn up and they are treated in a civilized way by the Israeli state, the Israeli people, who actually give them jobs. So you cannot at the same time complain that you're being oppressed and then the same sentence say that you're crossing to Jerusalem. I mean, that's our oppression. You're allowed to get in and out as you please. So, kind of telling.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lies packed into what each person says in each of these pieces, whether it's about the concept of siege or prison, when you can clearly see it isn't, when it's whether it's about the food or drink being available to the area, and we're talking prior to October 7th here and what they're responding to. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube showing perfectly, markets full of food and drink and in Gaza, and it having plenty of thriving food available to any citizen that needs it. So or needed it at the time before they chose to carry out the October 7th attack. So all of that is the kind of lies we're talking about. And then there's the aspects of ideology, which you see in it as well. The aspect that when the guy is talking about shooting people for fun or for the enjoyment of the soldiers, I mean, that's the way that the Hamas and the ideology of the Islamists look at things. That's what they take from such actions. So they're therefore projecting and assuming that that's how the IDF are reacting, when, of course, we're talking self-defense from the side of the IDF. So I think, and when they're talking about the language of power, the language of force, that is the language that they understand and have grown up with. So that's the core of their ideology.
Yeah, and let's not forget, everyone, that what they're talking about, although they want to talk about the whole context of the conflict, and we can talk about that as well, they're talking about what happened on October 7th. So when she's saying, look, there's someone here to protect me, and I'm against all violence, except, some action needs to be taken, which is a wonderful euphemism, isn't it? What she's talking about are the people who went in, brutally murdered people, burnt down their homes, tortured them, raped them, and so on. So that's what's being referred to, and it's surely not as if they don't know that's what went on, and it's not as if they just went in and killed IDF soldiers. Now that would have been bad enough, but they don't even have a pretense that the soldiers were going in, or the Hamas fighters were going in to kill soldiers and happen to kill civilians in the crossfire or something. That wouldn't be okay, but that's not even the pretense. It's people are, what do you expect, was what one of the young guys said. So there's a complete justification of the violence. There's an affection for Hamas coming from that lady there as well. And I think it's just so appalling. And all of these interviews are just vox pop kind of interviews with people on the street. It isn't like Bari Weiss, so far as we can see, has gone and curated to find the worst people. She seems to have just stopped people who will be willing to talk to her and who are quite willing to show their face. Later on, there's a girl who wants to hide her face and I think disguise her voice. But these people quite happy to say it, let the world know that this is how they feel about it. And so when we talk a bit later about how the international community thinks about the Palestinians, people should pay attention. One of the things Bari Weiss refers to later on in the video is that all the polls indicate basically what these people are saying, which is that lots of the Palestinians support Hamas and what's going on with what happened on October 7th. And so, Matthew, it's nice to see you. We just watched a little bit of the video and paused it, and we're going to keep watching it, if that sounds good.
Sure. So sorry I'm late, everyone. I'm in the middle of a trial and things are sort of overrun at court a bit, but
No.
I'm here now.
No worries. You look very swish. All right, guys.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Let's continue with the video, Daniel.
Are here and we will defend our rights.
They took an Israeli people without no rights in Gaza City, but they do the same thing here. Like, the Israeli government took a lot of people here, and it's not like excused just because they are a government. They took childs here. They took everyone. They hit everyone. Just look at them in the checkpoints. They treat us like animals, like worse than animals. Why is that for?
A lot of polls suggest that many Palestinians support what happened that day. Is that accurate from what you talk to people in your neighborhood and your community?
Most people agree with happened with the 7 October. 70% موافقين، فيش نقاش هذا فيها. ال 30% في قلبهم موافقين بس بيقدرش يعلنوا.
Are you part of the 70% or the 30%?
أنا من 100 ل1%.
So you more than 100% support it?
الشغلة مش إنه نأيد القتل، مفهومنا مش نأيد القتل إحنا. مفهوم الشغلة، الظلم في له نتيجة، هذا هو. الظلم البزرع إحنا عندنا مثل البزرع حمص بجنه حمص، البزرع حمص، البزرع شوك بزرع شوك، هذه النتيجة.
You've lived through.
Pause it there, Daniel. So I mean, so he's saying the thing about chickpeas: you reap what you sow. And he's saying the same thing that all these other people said, which is that he doesn't support killing, but there's this thing about justice, right? So whilst they're trying to hand wave and say that they don't support killing, actually they contradict themselves in the next sentence. Yes, they do. And they supported the brutal mutilation of the civilians. Mark and Richard, I know we just stopped it very quickly compared to the other one, but what did you think about those two just there?
I think, again, it betrays the essential of the culture in those areas, that it's all, we're never responsible for anything. God will provide, and all this kind of attitude that they never criticize the powerful. They know exactly that who's behind it, what's behind it, what causes it, and why they're doing it. I mean, they're all probably. All of them are Muslims, so they know what their religion is after. They know what the Palestinian Authority, and certainly they know what Hamas was after. Hamas had a very clear constitution and sets of document which was voted on. People in Gaza voting for Hamas knew exactly what was in those documents, and they voted for it. So, where's the surprise?
Yeah, there was a couple of words I wanted to say about her introduction just on the first clip, just before we get too far away from it, while I think of it, which was about the disengagement from the Gaza Strip in the first place, and the fact that it's been run by Gazans for Gazans for the last, since then, and there's no recognition of that. It's as if that doesn't exist and hasn't happened, and is a fabrication when it's patently not. And also the fact that she, Bari Weiss, refers to the Gaza Strip as being like run by the mob, where everybody's complicit to some level. Everybody knows what's going on, and that's a big part of what we've been talking about on this channel when it comes to the supposed innocence of adult Palestinians. Given how pervasive it is right through the culture and how it would need to be in order to function to the extent that it has in terms of functioning for evil as it clearly has. I think that interview with the guy who talks about the 70%, 30%, 101%, you see the absolute joy and delight in his claiming to be 101% in favor of absolute death and destruction of Jews. He thinks he's talking to a friend there, clearly. So this, I mean, there's no sense he's being conned into saying this statement. This is clearly his opinion, and he's very relaxed about saying so, no doubt because that's what they hear and say to each other all the time, whether there's a microphone under their mouth or not.
And Matthew, what was your response to the video or anything else you've seen?
Well, whole thing just struck me as, you know, a group of people who are completely disjointed from reality, frankly. It's like October the 7th almost just, or not so much October the 7th, but the consequences of October the 7th in terms of the Israeli response. It just doesn't seem to register with them. There's no recognition, that what Hamas did on October the 7th was barbaric. B, even if they don't recognise that, there's no recognition of what has happened to the Gaza Strip since, in terms of the Israeli response, which has unfortunately resulted in massive civilian loss of life and destruction of a huge amount of the infrastructure and the buildings there. They just don't, you know, they're sort of just saying, it's like they're brainwashed. They still want to just kill the Jews. Like, they don't realise they're dealing with a massively more powerful opponent, and there's no way that Hamas are possibly going to militarily win this.
And I think so. The thing that the young guy says, he's got the kind of curly mop on top.
Ooh.
One of the things that he says is that they kind of hassle us at checkpoints. Now that's true. And what's interesting about hearing these people,
they just
well, so in the West Bank, there's a number of military checkpoints. And I think my understanding is basically that people get searched or checked as they go through to check that they're not doing anything dangerous, basically. And what's interesting about that is he says, why are they doing that? They're treating us like animals. Now, certainly that experience isn't going to be pleasant. It's not nice to have an armed person be kind of suspicious of you and check out what's going on or harass you in any way. But what's interesting about this, and this is true of the international response as well, is a selective referring back to the context of the whole conflict, right? And you see these people doing this here. So it's sometimes the point is made by the kind of pro-Palestinian side. Well, look, there's all this context and you need to keep that in mind. And you do, but it doesn't go to the validation of their cause once you keep that in mind. They talk as if Israel instigated any of this. And yet the whole history of the conflict is of violence being instigated against Israel for its very existence. And then Israel having to respond with harsher and harsher measures. And my understanding is that the checkpoints were introduced again as a sort of ramping up of the conflict. And so now I don't doubt that it's unpleasant. I don't want to go through a military checkpoint. I was once kind of given a load of rubbish by the gendarmes in Paris, and it's not nice to have guys with machine guns just tell you what to do and be sort of rude, presuming that's what the IDF actually are doing. But if they are, it's for reasons of self-defense. And if you want that situation to go away, you cannot continue to support what happened on October 7th or Hamas or really Fatah or any of this stuff. So these people selectively refer back to the conflict when it suits their point of view and blank it out the rest of the time and completely blank out that there's any validity to Israel's existence. And ultimately, why? Because they're extremely anti-Semitic.
Yeah. And you know, I was going to refer to a checkpoint as well, because some of the people who are, lots of the people who are held in the prison from the so-called Palestinians held in the Israeli prisons is because they often committed attacks against Israel. And the most common attack is actually trying and break through a checkpoint, or assaulting or trying to kill a soldier at the checkpoint. And I remember that one of the people who was released in the previous so-called deal was actually a woman who rammed a car through the checkpoint and killed an IDF soldier. So, all these things happen all the time. Of course, the press doesn't report it because, killing Jews seems to be all right. But if you chip a nail to a Palestinian, oh, good God.
Yeah, I mean, with this treating us like animals thing, it seems to be related to being patted down, being forced to go through a checkpoint, feeling that they've been insulted by having to stop. Whereas the treating people worse than animals occurred obviously on October 7th with the butchering of Israeli soldiers and civilians by Hamas. So even the language doesn't apply in the same way as any thinking person, any rational person, any objective person would apply it when looking at the two situations.
Yeah, and something that comes up, and which is, again, it's something that's very common in the international response, is when he said about there's this idea of justice, and one of the previous people made a similar point in a sense that this is resistance to occupation or to violence that the Israelis are instigating. And it is not. It was instigated by the Palestinians and by the other Arab neighbors, if we're talking all the way back to 1948. And if people want the checkpoints to go away, which is understandable, it's probably not very nice, then what there needs to be is a lack of a credible threat of violence coming from the people. It isn't just an arbitrary imposition by the Israelis, which is so often the accusation, the idea that the Israelis want to be cruel and mean. And yet there's no credible evidence for that at all. So there's so much about what's said which is slanted and not credible at all, which is how Bari Weiss introduces the video. Anything else before we continue?
Well, I think it's probably worth noting, to my understanding, the crossing between Egypt and into Gaza actually also has similar border checkpoints. So it's not just the Israelis who are sort of having massive security on the checkpoints. It's Egypt as well, because they one assumes recognizes that there's a serious problem with Hamas in Gaza, and they don't want to import terrorists. I mean, Egypt's got its own problems with an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, who are closely linked to Hamas. So they don't want them getting in their side either. It's not just the Israelis.
Yeah, it's a common thing that people forget about.
As I said earlier on, the existence of checkpoint, it means that Israel allows them into Jerusalem to get them to work. So if you want to make a living, you can go into Israel and work. And that goes also against the argument, how can they escape Hamas? How can they escape the Palestinian Authority? Well, they can cross the border and ask for asylum, or they can go on any of the UN people on the ground all the time and say, I want asylum. Those guys are Hamas. These are the details. They hold this kind of hostages. They could just give them in and hand themselves to the journalists or UN or Israeli forces on the ground if they really want to escape. But they don't want to escape. They just want to be there and help the effort in killing more Jews, because that's what they want to do ultimately.
And phrases like injustice has consequences, it's just like a euphemism for, the Jews deserve to die on October the 7th. That's what they mean by that statement. And the token effort to say, I don't like killing or whatever at the beginning of each sentence is even more unbelievable than it is here in the West from the same people who trumpet the same lines.
Yeah, it's so naked, isn't it? And it's strange how they just contradict themselves. And I don't know whether it's because they want to be seen as sympathetic, or probably because they kind of have to lie to themselves a little bit, aside from that guy who said about the 101%, although actually maybe I think he actually even said it. Maybe they have to lie to themselves about the brutality they themselves are in favor of, because maybe that is actually hard to admit to yourself. But all right, Daniel, let's continue with the video.
الرقم اللي بزرع شوك بزرع شوك هذه النتيجة.
You've lived through other wars, other times of intensity and aggression and stress. What feels different about now?
قلت لك انه حرب 7 اكتوبر اوصل القضيه للعالم كله، مش زي الانتفاضات اللي وسيسوها، ولا زي يعني زي ما تقول حل جزئي. هلا الحل رايح يكون جذري، يعني مش حل جزئي. يعني يجب على انه العالم يساند للحل المعتدل.
Do you think that there's any possibility for two states in this land?
طلع حل الدولتين برضه مش رايح يحل القصه يعني كامله، لانه في بضل ظلم على بعض يعني زي ما تقول الجهتين، في ضيها بتكون مظلومه، وحل الدوله برضه مش رايح يكون حل مزبوط، لانه رايح تكون في شويه عنصريه برضه.
فلسطين حرة يعني يمكن احنا بنحكيها كلام، بس لما نيجي نتخيلها صعب نتخيلها، لأنه ما عمرنا عشنا الحرية، ما بنعرف شو يعني حرية.
My vision for Palestinians' future is gonna be like harder. They're gonna be more rude for Palestinians, and the checkpoints, they're gonna put more checkpoints. The genocide that happened in Gaza, like, we never saw it before. It's worse than what happened in 70 years ago, or I don't know, it's just like no one is gonna have his life back. No one is gonna think as he was thinking before. The mindset for everyone here in Palestine is gonna change.
ومقهورين انه ليش بناكل، ليش بنشرب، ليش بنعيش، ليش بنتنفس، حتى ليش في هالقد موت حوالينا، ريحة الموت كل مكان. اشي كتير بقهر، اشي كتير يعني بسم البدن، بخليك ما تحب تعيش.
حياتنا بصراحة كتير حاليا هي مؤلمة نفسيا. احنا كل يوم بنشاهد قتل 200 و300 بين طفل وامرأة في غزة. هذا الاشي أثر على نفسياتنا، وممكن كمان صار الواحد يفكر انه يعني هو مش في امان، وممكن انه كمان زاد عنا انه الواحد يعني لا لازم نقاتل هذا الاحتلال، لانه هذا الاحتلال مش راح يخلينا احنا في سلام في الايام القادمه، فهو عماله بقتل في اهلنا في غزه، فممكن انه يجي يقتلنا في يوم من الايام هان. فكل يعني الاغلب الشعب الفلسطيني بعد هاي القتل الوحشي والاباده اللي بتعمل فيه اسرائيل في غزه، لا صرنا نفكر كثير كيف راح نحمي حالنا في المستقبل.
It's not easy.
Yeah. So, well, actually, maybe we should just finish the video because I think that's the final interview just there, Daniel, and then we can just reflect on the whole thing.
As a Palestinian, to share my thoughts,
Why?
It's not easy.
Why?
I really don't think I should be saying anything.
Because are you nervous that if you spoke your mind that something bad would happen?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Probably.
This young woman didn't want her face shown on camera.
What do you actually think?
It's hard. It's really hard. I mean, it hasn't been easy for either states, and do you see the way, like, we're literally oppressed. We're literally oppressed. There's no future here.
Yeah.
Really, there's no future.
Do you feel hopeless?
Yeah. Honestly, genuinely, yes.
Always, or especially in the past few months?
Always. There's no future in this country. There's no future.
Okay, we can pause it there. So what did you guys make of that final one? Because what's interesting about the final girl is she's the only one who decided that she didn't want her face on there. And maybe that is her voice, but maybe they even disguised her voice as well, but that's probably her. But so when I first watched the video and that came up at the end, I thought maybe she was hiding her face because she was going to voice a kind of pro-Israeli opinion and didn't want to fear repercussions from her neighbors, in effect. And yet, actually, based on what she said, I don't think that is what her perspective seems to be. I think it's more like she's afraid for repercussions either from Israel or from people internationally. She doesn't want her face put out there for the cause she's sympathizing with. What impression did you guys have of that final girl there? And Mark and Richard, if we can start with you. You guys, you're muted still.
Sorry about that. It's hard to tell exactly what she was on about, but the fact that she didn't express a pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian opinion probably is enough for her to be in trouble if anyone ever noticed that. Also, the way that the other girl spoke about, oh, I don't even know what freedom is. Well, freedom is you being able to choose not to wear a scarf in your head in the first place. They don't even realize that. And the scandal, I mean, just allow some Islamic nutter to get to become your ruler and to force you to live according to their rules. You find out what freedom was. Freedom would have been the thing that you lost, but at that point it would be too late. It's just depressing and annoying to hear this kind of comments.
My thoughts on that last woman are well, assuming it is her voice, which you can't be certain, to be honest, but if it is, then she's a pretty fluent English speaker. She's probably one of the most fluent, which could give credence to your statement that she knows how that comes across. And therefore, even if she's spouting the standard Palestinian line, she doesn't want her face to be seen, around the world doing so. I think you could read it the other way, to be honest, and there's not enough context to be able to say for certain. The oppression she's talking about could be from the kind of leadership they live under in both the West Bank, the Arab leadership, and in Gaza under Hamas. And if that's the oppression that she's talking about, which we've often, highlighted is the case, any oppression comes from their own leadership, their own side, then that would also explain why she wouldn't want her face shown. But so any of those is possible. All of those is plausible. All of those fits with the broader analysis that we're making here. So, to some extent, they're all valid points to make based on what we know.
Matthew, what did you think?
For me, I think the two sort of standout moments in the whole video were actually the two ladies we saw in that last section. The first one basically saying she doesn't understand what freedom is, and that just kind of rams home the point, really. Hamas took power in 2006, I think. So it hasn't been an election there since. So it's been Hamas the whole time, with this education system seemingly sort of indoctrinating all the children to hate the Israelis and that the occupation is evil and so forth. And excuse me, you've essentially got a whole generation there now who've grown up being almost force-fed that mentality, and they just don't know anything different. And that's really a bit of a concern for afterwards, for after Israel's finished this and destroyed Hamas's military capacity or whatever. They're still going to have this problem that the population have been raised basically hating them, and how do you really start again in that context? And the other girl who spoke right at the end, by contrast, seemed to realise that this whole situation is just hopeless. She says, she can see there's just no future in it, which seems struck me as quite a contrast with the first girl. She recognises that the whole situation's hopeless, but she doesn't, which is a start, but she doesn't seem to have any idea where to go with it, how to fix it, how to change things for the better, from what she's saying.
Yes, although bear in mind, I think they're in Ramallah in the West Bank, not in Gaza. But the UNRWA schools do operate there as well, as I understand. So it's entirely possible. Well, that propaganda would have come through there as well. The middle-aged woman who spoke about we can't breathe freely, as well. So there's a point that Yaron Brook sometimes makes in his kind of pro-capitalism speech, where he's talking about the nature of freedom and how everyone says that they're in favor of freedom. And this lady's basically saying that she kind of wants to live freely. But what does that really mean for her? That's kind of the point that you guys are making. Is it to live under an authoritarian Islamic government where Israelis aren't able to live there? Because that's not living freely. That's just living under the dictator of your choice. And nobody has a right to that at all. I agree that the girl at the end could be interpreted sympathetically. And if what we saw any of these people saying was we want to live in a liberal state with protections for human rights, the rule of law, freedom of expression, where anyone can come and live freely so long as they, keep to themselves, so to speak, they don't force anyone else, then that they would entirely have my sympathy, and I would feel bad for them having to live in such a rotten situation. But none of the people said that, none at all. And I think people should see this. And if you're someone who feels that the Palestinians have kind of been maligned and they aren't like Hamas and they aren't Fatah, they've just had this kind of imposed on them, I think you should see this and realize, actually, no, this doesn't seem to be what they're like at all. And when Bari Weiss is referring to the polling, you naturally want to make sure that polling is done in the right way, taking into account the right sample sizes and controls and all that kind of stuff. And these interviews seem to validate the results of the polling entirely. So it isn't like they're being maligned at all. And so what do you guys, as we say, the context is basically that a lot of people in the international community would seem to disbelieve that this is what Palestinians believe. Someone tweeted something on the other day that I saw. They had an AI generated image and they said, this is what the international community believes. And it's like a Hamas soldier with a woman in a hijab and they're carrying a rainbow banner behind them and smiling and looking really happy. And that isn't what these people are like, very clearly. And what do you think motivates that belief? Because if people really wanted to go find out what their opinions are, it isn't like this is very hard. I just saw this pop up on YouTube last night. So what do you think motivates that?
Well, before I go into that, I'd like to mention another couple of things that from the last clip. First of all, the older lady wondering why there's death all around her. Well, that comes from your culture. Your culture celebrates death, and that's what you get when you do that. I mean, it's a very easy answer, actually. And then. The other old bloke who says something like, October 7th is a good thing to happen, so people now will pay us attention. Really? I mean, all we know about the Middle East, that there is this flipping Palestinian thing here that never goes away. And I mean, it's as ludicrous as the Trans Awareness Week. People don't talk about anything else about trans. How can you not be aware of it? It's just mind-boggling. But going back to your question, the international community, partially because we will call it primacy of consciousness, and partially because of ignorance, they would love to think that these guys, because they are poor, they love to live on benefits by the UN. Effectively, UNRWA is the welfare state for Hamas, isn't it? So they like to get handouts and do very little. Because they're not as rich as Israel, they got to be the darlings of the left and generally of the do-gooders who push altruism at every turn. And partially because they don't understand, the West doesn't understand exactly how things work in certain parts of the world. They would like to come across like, just because they go on holiday there and they enjoy, stay at the Hilton or whatever, they assume that they've seen and they understand. Well, but they do not. The statement that the journalist made at the beginning of the video, that they behave like the mob, is totally accurate. If you think about how the mafia in southern Italy, and something I'm very well familiar with, acts, the mafia is embedded in the culture, and people even have a word which says we don't talk about them, or we don't put them in a position where we actually tell you where they are. So we protect them by shutting down conversation if that happens. And that's why this kind of stuff is so ingrained in the population. And that's why when you say adults are guilty, adults are Hamas, people in Gaza are Hamas, is because even if they're not actively supporting the acts, so they're not legally able to be prosecuted for that, they will protect them. They will know where they are, but they will look away. And that's what the West doesn't understand. This kind of behavior is part of a culture that do not understand, and if they understood, they would move away from, because they cannot perceive that poor people are actually bad people.
I think in terms of the international community and the response from the West, and by this I don't just mean the leaders of the West, I mean the people on the marches, the people in the media, the people on college campuses in the US and the UK, etc. I think part of this you can take as a don't ask a question you don't want the answer to, because as soon as you do ask the question, rather than just speculate vaguely about what the Palestinian people might think, and therefore assume that they're as lovely as you are in their outlook, then you wouldn't want this vox pop to even occur. You wouldn't want it to be shown. You wouldn't want the evidence to be out there, to add to all the other evidence, for it to be yet another piece of evidence that's ignored in the greater picture of things. I think the other thing that I strikes me from this is just the similarity between what some of these people say on the streets of the West Bank and on the campuses. So there isn't a vast amount of difference. The parroting of Hamas propaganda, whether read off Twitter or spouted to a journalist like Bari Weiss in this situation, is almost identical. It's the same terminology. It's the same phrases. To many people, there probably wouldn't be the shock at actually hearing the words out of the mouths of these people in the West Bank that there should be. And the point that Marco made about, or you made, about bringing it to the world's attention, which several of them refer to. The guy who talks about he's got 1% sympathy for the Jews on October 7th. He says, just now they see us, as in the international community only now can see what the situation in Palestine is like. But of course, as I said earlier, footage that showed the Gaza Strip during, prior to October the 7th shows exactly what it was like, and that there wasn't the oppression that you're talking about and claiming was the impetus for doing October 7th in the first place.
Matthew, do you have any other thoughts on the video or on the international community's sort of disbelief that this is their opinion?
Just a couple of points on the international community. I think there seems to be something I think probably comes ultimately from altruism. My sense is that people just seem to feel like they ought to be effectively sort of backing the underdog, and they see Gaza as being the underdog because Israel is perceived to be this sort of successful, thriving society, whereas Gaza, rightly or wrongly, is still regarded as, in some senses, occupied, despite the fact that Israel pulled out in 2005, and they're seen as being the sort of victims in the situation. It's just a perennial issue with how the altruist mentality kind of analyzes the situation. Excuse me, I keep coughing. Beg your pardon. My other thought in terms of the international community's response is how things have changed since the end of World War II, frankly. I know it's not a precise analogy, but Japan during World War II was similar to Gaza in the sense that they had this kind of religious cult, sort of focused on the Japanese emperor in their case, that he was regarded as being sort of a living god, and they were regarded as being the superior race. And the education system basically forced that down everyone's throats from a young age. And at the end of World War II, what the West did, rightly in my view, was force them to change the culture. And there just doesn't seem to be either the recognition of the issue or the will to sort of force the cultural change. It's just not, doesn't seem to be there on the part of the West's leaders at the moment.
Yes, and I'll just read out our couple of super chats just before I say something. So we have 200 yen, I think that is, from Cargo Crew. Thank you very much. And then $5 from John Was, who says, great discussion. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, John.
So yeah, I agree with what you said, Richard, about the culture. And I think it's important for people to remember that cultures only survive so long as the people who embody them and who embody those values continue to support them. If they don't, then cultures decay, and then eventually it reaches a kind of critical mass and it changes all at once, or it will gradually change over time. What seems to be happening in Iran is that although the government is very much trying to instill this regressive, awful culture on the people are resisting it because they seem to have ascribed to different values, and good for them. And I really hope they're able to get out from underneath it. And so there's an essay by Ayn Rand called Political Crimes. I think this is the right one, where she makes a point about governments in the 20th century, which end up not being able to really punish certain kind of political criminals in the right kind of way. And people are a bit baffled by it. And she basically makes the point, if this is the right essay I'm thinking of, that the reason why that happens is because the people in the government ultimately share some of the ideology of the criminals they're persecuting. So they end up being a bit soft on them. And I think in terms of the international community's response, whilst that some of the sympathy is going to be coming from people who are also Islamists and so are going to support these people, when it's coming from kind of lefty Westerners who read The Guardian or on university campuses, whilst they might not be Islamists, they're going to share some fundamental political views with these people, or at best what they're going to be are multiculturalists who believe in national self-determination, where it's like, yeah, you're a national group, you do whatever you want, we can't judge it either way. If you want to instill a regressive, awful, authoritarian government, that's your way and that's your right to do that, no matter how many of your own people you oppress, and no matter how many of the good people amongst your population that there may be who want to live freely. Yeah, that can happen. And so I think that's part of why the international community is so soft in it. I think also the reasons you guys brought up is there as well. And I think, in effect, what we see from the international community is a huge amount of evasion of the attitudes of the Palestinians. Because even in the teeth of all this evidence, if they acknowledged that the people they were supporting as the victims in all this were really in favor of brutal killing and murder, it would be so much harder for them to rationalize their position. They might still be able to do it for some of them, but a lot of people would suddenly be racked with doubt and uncertainty. And so they have to keep it as a kind of article of faith. Even before they've looked at the evidence, they've assumed, oh, well, the Palestinian people are innocent, they don't share these opinions, Hamas is just some kind of freak entity that's imposed itself on them and they're completely different. Whereas I don't think that's credible at all.
No.
Yeah. But okay, was there any other thoughts you guys had before we just in the last 10 minutes?
Yeah, I'd like to make a point that probably some of the Hamas supporters and terrorism apologists will comment, oh, you can't rely on that set of interviews because they were probably edited together and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's fine. Those interviews just tell me that those particular people have got that particular point of view. My moral judgment on the people of Gaza comes from their actions. And again, mentioning Ayn Rand, the essay, The Culture of Moral Greyness, and how do you live a rational life in a rational society, she makes the point that you don't have to shy away from making a moral judgment on something. And of course, the moral judgment has to be objective. You don't have to psychologize or whatever. But just based on the actions that the people in Gaza and the so-called Palestinian take on a daily basis, by throwing rockets into Israel, by doing what they've done October 7, by saying the things they said, by answering the polls, and by the behavior that they keep doing. That's the basis of our judgment. And when that guy asks, why do we treat us like animals? Well, because some of you behave like such. Some of you behave like animals. They go into Israel and rape and murder, and then they celebrate it. So that's what happens to you when you behave in a certain way. Your choice of behavior comes from your ideas. If your ideas are bad, your behavior is bad. And I'm not going to stop from making the point, these guys are bad, because that's what they are. They show the true colors at every opportunity.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Vox Pop format as a journalistic tool in a normal setting, but there are so many people who profess to speak for the average Palestinian on the streets that this kind of Vox Pop is thoroughly necessary. And if there are people who doubt that this Vox Pop is showing a representative sample, then go do your own. Because just saying it's not representative without any evidence to put forward to suggest the counter argument is just not gonna hold it for me. And it's as we've mentioned before, taken into the wider context of all the other facts we know about Palestinian life and what Hamas have done right under the noses of every Palestinian who lives in Gaza. I wanted to say a couple of words about the guy who spoke about the solutions going forward. You know, the guy who spoke about the two-state solution, and he thought the one-state solution would also include racism, and all he wanted was a moderate solution. And all of this terminology that is always looking for I just want it to be solved. And solved, what does that mean? Particularly out of the mouths of people who have been justifying violence dismissively within their first sentence. Is the moderate solution another October the 7th that's more thorough? You know, what does that really mean? There's a lot of either the euphemism means something much more sinister, or it just means an evasive inability to look at the true facts and come up with an actual solution that is workable, that, you know, because they won't recognize that really involves giving up on your ideology, the evil ideology that worships death above life. And my overall point for the whole thing is the delight that the propaganda of Hamas is working. You can see that the delight that despite even the suffering of the Palestinian people that they talk about in one breath, they're delighted that the international community is hearing their voices, their oppression, and they are at the peak of the victim pyramid right now, and that they're going to get stuff as a result. That seems to come out loud and strong.
We just got to wrap up a few minutes early, but any brief final comments, Matthew?
Well, the sort of so-called moderate solution, I don't know what that gentleman precisely had in mind. Generally, the two-state solution is regarded as the moderate solution, certainly internationally. That's been on the table repeatedly since 1947. And as far as anyone can tell, the Arabs don't actually want it, do they?
Yes, and that's
then they reject it at every turn. What they want, I think, is a one-state solution, by which they mean there's no more Israel.
Yeah, and we could almost do a whole video on the ways that Israel's shown generosity and had it thrown back in their face.
Yeah.
But all right, guys, we'll wrap up. So thank you very much for everyone for watching. This is a slightly more unusual video from what we normally do, but you know, we in a sense do commentary, and I think this useful kind of boot and spade kind of journalistic work is really useful. I wanted to just share that with you guys because I thought it'd be useful for you guys to see. But I hope you all enjoyed it. Daniel, do we have something going live at 7?
We have the Fountainhead Book Club for ARCUK members.
Fantastic. Well, I hope everyone signs up if you're not signed up already, and you go along to that, because that's a really thorough book club run by Antoine, and it's really good. So you should all head over to there. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you again tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.